June 2nd, 1944. Brenham, Texas. This photograph is believed to have been taken by an unknown U.S. Army correspondent, just weeks before the war in Europe reached its deadliest peak. At first glance, it appears simple. A young American sergeant offering a glass of milk to a trembling woman inside a small-town supermarket. But the woman is not an American shopper. She is a German prisoner of war, brought to the United States only days earlier. Why does she look terrified in a place overflowing with food? Why does the sergeant's expression seem caught between duty and concern? And what moment of truth was unfolding when the shutter clicked? Historians who rediscovered this image decades later ask the same question. What really happened in that supermarket? And why did this single gesture change her forever? June 12th, 1944. Brenham, Texas. The screen door of the baker's market swung open with a soft creak, and the cool breath of refrigerated air drifted out into the heat like something impossible, a whisper from another world. Standing frozen on the threshold, her boots still dusty from the POW transport truck, Liesel Weber stared into the bright interior as if she had stumbled into a hallucination brought on by hunger. The smell reached her first. Not gunpowder, not smoke, not the sour stench of crowded barracks, but coffee, sugar, fresh bread, and peaches and syrup. For a woman who had survived the winter famine of Berlin, the scent alone felt violent. Behind her, an American MP cleared his throat gently. "Go on," he said, not unkindly. "Mrs. Baker just needs help carrying groceries. That's all." But the words barely registered. Liesel couldn't move. She had spent the last 3 years learning that every open door meant danger, that every promise of mercy concealed a trap. Nothing in her life had prepared her for a supermarket. She had seen the word in English textbooks growing up, imagined something like a corner shop. But this glowing cavern of abundance, was beyond comprehension. It was larger than the entire block where she'd lived in Berlin. Aisles of polished floors stretched into the distance. Shelves sagged under the weight of canned goods. Glass cases held rows of bright fruit, as if orchards had survived the war untouched here. A soft hum rose from towering refrigerators, machines that seemed to breathe cold air endlessly, without rationing, without fear. Her mind rejected it. Her body believed it. Her stomach tightened painfully. Just 48 hours earlier, she had stepped off a ship in New Orleans, convinced the Americans would beat her, humiliate her, or starve her. German officers had repeated the warnings. The Americans are brutal. They will take revenge on our women. Better to die than be captured. Yet, standing here now, she felt something far more destabilizing than fear. She felt safe. And the betrayal of that feeling made her tremble. Mrs. Baker, a middle-aged woman with flour on her apron, stepped toward her with a smile as warm as the Texas morning. "You must be Liesel. Don't worry, sweetheart. You're not here to clean floors or anything like that. I just need another pair of hands." Sweetheart. No guard, no officer, no stranger had used such a word for her since 1939. Liesel clutched the strap of her canvas POW bag. It held everything she owned: a comb, a spoon, a patched skirt, and a photograph of her parents that had survived 2 bombings. The bag suddenly felt ridiculously small in a store where even the shelf of pet food contained more meat than her entire neighborhood had seen in months. Her eyes locked onto a display of canned peaches. The bright golden fruit swam in clear syrup behind pristine glass. A vision so vivid, her throat tightened. She remembered her mother rationing, a single bruised apple into 5 slices. She remembered standing in bread lines for hours only to receive a crust that tasted like sawdust. Now, peaches, hundreds of them, sat stacked neatly in pyramids, as if war did not exist. Her breath hitched. She raised a shaking hand to her mouth. The American MP stepped forward, worried she might faint. "Ma'am, you all right?" Ma'am, not prisoner, not enemy, not German. The store was crowded. A young housewife pushing a cart nodded politely at Liselle. A freckle-faced boy pointed excitedly at the candy counter. Two farmers in dusty overalls carried sacks of flour. No one stared at her with hatred. No one blamed her for the war. No one saw her as a threat. She felt a wave of vertigo, as though the entire world had tilted sideways. Germany had told her that America was decadent, weak, chaotic, that its people were soft and spoiled and terrified of hardship. Yet these Americans looked sturdy, confident, fed. They moved through the aisles with the calm assurance of people who had never known hunger. And the sheer volume of food. It wasn't just abundance, it was strength, industrial, agricultural, moral. Her legs finally carried her inside. The door closed behind her with a click that felt like the sealing of fate. She stepped into the aisle of dried goods and ran her fingers along the rows. Rice, beans, flour, sugar. In Berlin, each of these items required coupons, bargaining, and luck. Here they sat untouched, waiting. A whisper escaped her lips. This cannot be real. But it was real. Every jar, every can, every orange glowing beneath the lights, proof that the world was not as she had been taught. Proof that America lived in a different universe. Proof that the war had been lost long before any battlefield. The MP watched her, recognizing that look. He had seen it on other POWs before. Not fear of punishment, fear of understanding, because understanding was the beginning of truth, and truth was the beginning of collapse. Liselle lifted a can of peaches into her hands. It was heavier than she expected. She held it as if it were a newborn bird, fragile, miraculous. Mrs. Baker touched her elbow gently. "We get more of those every week," she said. "The cannery down the road is always busy." Every week, as if factories could simply produce sweetness endlessly. Liselle swallowed hard. Her voice was thin. "In Germany. We haven't seen fruit like this in 2 years." Mrs. Baker's smile faded, replaced by something soft and sorrowful. "War takes from everyone, doesn't it?" But then she brightened again. "Come on now, let's grab what we need. Supper won't cook itself." Liselle followed her, stepping deeper into the glowing aisles. Behind her, the MP watched silently, knowing what every American guard eventually learned. For some POWs, the first true shock was not captivity, it was kindness. And for many, the most devastating battlefield was the inside of a grocery store. With every step, Liselle felt the world she had known, cracking, the story she had been told, unraveling, the enemy she had feared, becoming human. She did not yet understand it. She would. But on that bright Texas morning, standing in a supermarket filled with food enough to feed a village, one truth rose unbidden and terrifying in her chest. Germany had never stood a chance. Fear did not strike Liselle in a single moment. It seeped in quietly, like cold water slipping through the cracks of a sinking ship, slow, relentless, impossible to push back once it touched her skin. She had expected terror the moment she surrendered. She had expected blows, screaming guards, chains. Instead, something far more destabilizing had happened. Nothing. No beatings, no threats, no humiliation. Just a strange, unnerving stillness that followed her everywhere in America. And fear thrives in silence. On the ship that brought her to the United States, Liselle had slept curled like an animal against the steel wall of the hold. Above her, the ocean groaned. Around her, German women whispered in the dark. Not about home. Not about food. Not even about the war. They whispered about America. The Americans will cut your hair and parade you through the streets. They let their black soldiers do anything they want to German women. If you resist, they hit you with batons. If you don't resist, they laugh at you. Nobody leaves American camps alive, not women. Propaganda was powerful because it fed the same fear that war itself created, the fear of the unknown. By the third night aboard the Liberty ship, Liesel believed every rumor. Terror was easier to accept than hope. Even when New Orleans came into view, white buildings glowing in the humid morning sun, she had braced herself for cruelty. She waited for the rifles, the dogs, the hatred. None came. The guards spoke to them as if they were people, and that terrified her more than threats would have. On the truck ride from New Orleans to Texas, Liesel stared out the barred window and tried to understand this new country. The landscape rolled by. Farms, gas stations, diners, endless fields of corn and cotton. Everything was too calm, too abundant. Meanwhile, the last images she had of Germany burned behind her eyelids. Berlin, 1944. Smoke rising from entire districts. Rows of bombed-out apartments collapsing like broken ribs. Children waiting in ration lines for hours only to receive stale bread mixed with barley husks. Women boiling wallpaper to scrape out the paste for calories. Her mother had whispered one night, "It's not war anymore, Liesel. It's starvation with explosions." Factories that once produced radios and automobiles now struggled to produce a handful of tanks or rifles. Steel was rationed. Coal was gone. Railroads lay twisted in heaps after British bombing raids. Everything in Germany was shrinking. Food, fuel, hope, but America was growing. A guard riding in. The front seat of the truck said something she barely understood through his accent. "We're passing another plant. They build aircraft turbines here. Big place." The truck rattled past a long stretch of brick buildings with towering smokestacks. Workers, men and women both, streamed out for lunch break. Hundreds of them. All fed, all strong, all confident. For Liesel, it was like watching an army march. In Europe, German factories were being pounded into dust. In America, factories were being expanded. She remembered overhearing two American MPs at a rest stop the day before. "Did you hear? They're pumping out close to 100,000 aircraft this year." She thought she'd misheard. 100,000. Germany hardly made a fraction of that now. Another MP added, "And the Navy says we're launching Liberty ships every few days." Every few days. Germany could barely keep the ones it had afloat. When the scale of it settled into her mind, she felt physically smaller, as though her bones had shrunken inside her skin. How do you fight a country that grows stronger while at war? How does a starving nation defeat a land that treats sugar as casually as dirt? The fear she felt then wasn't fear of death. It was fear of understanding. Understanding that the war was lost long before she stepped onto American soil. Her first night at Camp Brenham, she lay awake on a cot, staring at the wooden beams of the ceiling. The sheets smelled of soap, real soap, thick, creamy, American-made soap. In Germany, soap had disappeared months ago. People used sand, ashes, anything. In the distance, she heard laughter. American guards playing cards, arguing about baseball. A sound so normal, so peaceful, it felt alien. Liesel closed her eyes. The air smelled faintly of bread baking somewhere across the compound. She hadn't smelled bread like that since 1942. She felt her pulse accelerate. Why is everything so clean? Why is everything so calm? Why do they have so much? She wanted someone to scream at her, to shove her, to confirm that the propaganda was right, that she should hate them, fear them, resist them. But instead, a female WAC officer had greeted them with warm blankets. A medic had checked their temperature and wounds. A clerk had said please and thank you while issuing their camp uniforms. Fear thrives on cruelty. Kindness disorients it, and Liselle was deeply, profoundly disoriented. The next morning, when Mrs. Baker brought her into town, that fear changed form. Inside the supermarket, fear became something sharper, more humiliating, like standing naked on a stage. Because here, in this brightly lit temple of American abundance, she could no longer pretend that Germany might still have a chance. She could no longer hide behind discipline or ideology. Instead, she had to confront a truth she had spent years avoiding. Germany had bet on iron and fire. America had bet on food, factories, and faith in its people. And America had won before a single soldier reached Berlin. She watched a teenage girl toss cookies into a shopping cart without checking a ration card. She watched elderly men buying sugar, meat, fruit, and coffee as if war were a rumor from another continent. She watched Mrs. Baker chat with neighbors, each of them smiling, unworried, unscarred. Fear swelled in her chest, not of America hurting her, but of America never needing to. How do you defeat a nation that feeds its prisoners better than your country feeds its citizens? She touched a bottle of milk and felt tears sting her eyes. In Germany, milk had become something whispered about, like a memory. In America, children spilled it on the floor and laughed. As she followed Mrs. Baker through the aisles, one question repeated in her mind. If their civilians live like this, what chance did our soldiers ever have? It was a question she couldn't speak aloud, not even to herself, because the answer would shatter everything her world had been built upon. But it was there, throbbing behind every canned peach and glowing refrigerator case, and fear, true fear, rose from a single revelation. The enemy was not who she thought they were. The enemy was stronger, richer, calmer, and kinder. Fear tells us what to avoid. Truth tells us who we are. And Liselle, clutching a grocery bag in a Texas supermarket, realized with a cold tightening in her stomach. She was afraid not of what America would do to her, but of what America already was. Because if this was ordinary life in the United States, then everything she had been taught about the war, about her country, about the future, was collapsing beneath her feet. On her third morning in America, Liselle awoke to the sound of boots on gravel and the soft clang of a bell signaling morning roll call. The Texas sun had just begun to warm the wooden barracks, painting thin shafts of light across the floorboards. She sat up slowly, confused as always by the quiet. No explosions, no distant sirens, no officers barking orders. Just birds, just sunlight, just peace. An unfamiliar luxury. As she stood in line outside, a young American GI approached her row, his uniform crisp, his hair still wet from a shower. He paused when he noticed her rubbing her face with her sleeve. Without a word, he reached into his pocket and held out a neatly folded white handkerchief. "Fresh laundry day," he said softly. "Take it." The gesture was so small that Liselle almost laughed at her own hesitation. But in Germany, no soldier had ever offered her anything unless they wanted something in return. She took the handkerchief slowly, her fingers brushing his. He nodded once, then moved on. In the chaos of war, kindness felt more shocking than cruelty. She pressed the soft cloth to her cheek, inhaling the faint smell of detergent. Clean, ordinary, human. She had forgotten what those things felt like. Later that morning, the camp work assignments were posted. Many women were sent to farms or canneries, but Mrs. Baker had specifically requested Lissoul again. The truck ride into town felt different this time. She no longer stared out the window in terror, but in bewildered fascination at the sweeping fields, the wide skies, the sense of stability that wrapped around the countryside like a blanket. When they arrived at the house, Mrs. Baker placed a glass of milk on the kitchen table. "You look tired," she said. "Drink." Milk. Real milk. Not the grayish, watered-down ersatz mixture she'd known in Germany. Lisa lifted the glass, watching the condensation run down its side. The first sip stunned her. Thick, cold, pure. It felt like swallowing sunlight. Her eyes burned, though she couldn't explain why. Mrs. Baker didn't ask. She simply placed a second glass in front of her. "You need it more than we do." For a moment, Liselle imagined her mother watching her from the kitchen doorway back home, nodding approval through tears. That afternoon, as they left the grocery store, they passed a ranch road where a cowboy was adjusting the saddle on a chestnut mare. He looked up at them with an easy grin beneath his hat. "Ma'am," he said to Mrs. Baker. Then he turned to Liselle. "You ever ride?" The question hit Liselle like a splash of cold water. Horses in Germany belonged to farmers, officers, or aristocrats. A prisoner riding? Unthinkable. She shook her head quickly. The cowboy chuckled. "No, better time to learn." Before she could protest, he kneeled beside her and began tightening the laces of her worn, camp-issued shoes. She froze, every muscle rigid. No man, not even her father, had ever knelt to help her like this, and certainly not an enemy soldier. He didn't seem to notice her shock. He finished the knot, gave it an approving tug, and stood. "Now you won't slip. Go on, give her a pet." The mare lowered her head, warm breath rolling against Liselle's hands. Her fear melted into something unfamiliar. Trust. Cowboys had been monsters in German propaganda. Wild, reckless killers. This one seemed more like a storybook character with dust on his boots and gentleness in his eyes. Back at the camp, kindness unfolded in small, unexpected ways. At the infirmary, a young chaplain, Father O'Donnell, visited the women's barracks carrying a small stack of books. Some were English Bibles, but others were worn German poetry collections and a tattered copy of Wilhelm Tell. "You ladies deserve something to read," he said. "War shouldn't take away your language." He spoke gently as though every word were a balm. Liselle accepted a book of Rilke's poems. The paper was soft, the ink faded. She hadn't held a book in 2 years. Reading had become a luxury reserved for peace. That night, under the dim glow of the barracks light, she read the opening lines aloud to herself. Her voice trembled at first, then steadied. For a moment, the war disappeared, and she was simply a young woman again, even if only within a few fragile pages. 2 days later, the guard detail assigned her and several other POWs to help clean a small community hall in town. When the women finished, an elderly American couple approached with a basket. "We figured you might be hungry," the man said with a shy smile. Inside the basket was cornbread, slices of ham, and jars of homemade preserves. Food preserved not for soldiers, not for officers, but for prisoners. Liselle stared at the spread, her heart thudding against her ribs. In Germany, civilians barely fed themselves. In America, civilians fed their enemies. As she hesitated, a little girl with pigtails peeked from behind the woman's skirt. She stared at Liselle, then stepped forward and handed her a cookie. Chocolate chip, warm from the oven. Liselle knelt slowly, unsure how to behave around a child in a place so foreign. The girl only smiled, bright, fearless, innocent. Something in Liesel's chest cracked open like thin ice. A child's smile was a small thing, but for a woman whose world had been shattered, it was a beginning. Back at camp that Sunday, the guards announced a special Liberty meal for the work detail. Some women braced for punishment, others for humiliation. Instead, the gates opened and a local family invited them inside for Sunday dinner. The dining table was set with white plates and polished silverware. A roast filled the room with an aroma so rich it seemed to wrap itself around Liesel's ribs. She took her seat hesitantly, her hands trembling in her lap. "Y'all eat," the host said. "We don't stand on ceremony here." They passed bowls of mashed potatoes, corn, and green beans grown in the family garden. Every gesture was simple, ordinary, profoundly human. Halfway through the meal, the host's teenage son placed a cold glass bottle beside Liesel. "Ever had one?" he asked. The label read Coca-Cola in bright red script. She shook her head. He popped the cap off with a laugh. "Well, welcome to America." She took a sip. Sweetness exploded across her tongue, sharp, sparkling, impossibly refreshing. Her eyes widened in disbelief. Back home, sugar was rationed to the point of myth. Here, it danced in a bottle. The boy laughed. Not cruelly, just delighted to share something ordinary with someone who'd never known it. She realized, with a jolt, that this was what Americans did best. Share what they had, even with strangers, even with enemies. At camp, the transformation continued in quiet ways. Each POW received 80 cents a day in camp scrip for labor, enough to buy soap, a comb, or a small bag of candy from the canteen. Liesel held her first pay stub with disbelief. A prisoner being paid to work. Her officers would have called it madness. But the American guards simply called it fairness. Rations were plentiful, 3,000 to 3,200 calories per day, more than her entire family had eaten even in the early years of the war. Bread arrived fresh. Meat appeared on their trays with bewildering regularity. The camp library contained magazines, dictionaries, even sheet music. And everywhere she looked, kindness bloomed quietly. A guard offering extra blankets during a cold night, a nurse braiding the hair of a girl too exhausted to lift her hands, a rancher sending a basket of apples to the camp just because. The rumors Liesel had believed her whole life now felt embarrassing. There were no beatings, no hatred, no vengeance. Instead, there was a feeling she did not know how to name, a soft, warm thing that spread slowly through her chest. Gratitude. A dangerous, disarming kind of gratitude. And beneath it, something deeper. The sinking realization that Americans didn't treat them well out of weakness or foolishness, but out of strength. Humanity here was not an accident. It was a strategy, a principle, a reflection of a nation confident enough to show mercy when the world expected cruelty. In the quiet moments before sleep, Liesel found herself touching the handkerchief in her pocket, the glass bottle she'd saved from Sunday dinner, the tiny book of poems beneath her pillow. She did not fully understand why these things mattered, but she felt it. Slowly, inexorably. America was changing her, and kindness, steady, patient, unassuming, was the force doing it. The moment Liesel's world finally cracked open did not arrive with violence or shouting. It arrived in the quietest way imaginable. Inside a grocery store, surrounded by metal shelves and fluorescent light, holding a simple can of peaches. She had lifted the can absent-mindedly, drawn to the picture of the golden fruit on the label. But as her fingers tightened around the cold metal, a strange trembling overtook her hands. At first, she thought it was hunger. Then she realized it was something deeper, older, an ache that had lived inside her for years. She whispered to herself, in German, barely audible, "Wir hatten nie so viel. Nicht einmal vor dem Krieg. We never had this much, not even before the war." The truth hit her with such force her knees weakened. Germany had taught her that scarcity was normal, that hunger was noble, that sacrifice defined strength. Yet here, in a country that sent millions of men overseas to fight a global war, aisles overflowed with abundance. She set the peach can back on the shelf with shaking fingers and grabbed a shelf edge to steady herself. She felt Mrs. Baker's hand on her back, gentle and steady. "You okay, honey?" Liselle tried to nod, but her breath caught. Tears blurred her vision before she could stop them. She raised a hand to cover her face, but a sob pushed past her lips. Sharp, humiliating, unstoppable. Mrs. Baker didn't react with surprise or discomfort. She simply guided Liselle to a small bench near the front of the store and sat with her, saying nothing. Just being there. Just existing beside her without judgment. Liselle cried like someone who had been holding her breath for years. Not the small, controlled tears of a soldier, but the deep, unraveling sobs of a young woman who had believed in a world that no longer existed. When she finally found her voice, it came out in fragments. "Children in Berlin." She couldn't finish. The words lodged in her throat. Mrs. Baker understood anyway. "We heard," she said softly. "War is cruelest to the little ones." Lisa looked up, her face streaked with tears. "There's food here for dogs," she said in disbelief. "In cans, with meat, real meat." Mrs. Baker hesitated. "I suppose so, yes. Why?" Liselle's voice broke. "Our children. Go to bed without bread. My neighbor boiled potato peels for her baby until even the peels ran out. And here you have meat for animals." Her voice fell to a whisper. "We lost the war long before we knew." It was the first time she'd spoken those words, not just aloud, but in her own mind, and saying them felt like lifting a stone that had been crushing her chest. When they left the store, the sun was bright, the air warm. Liselle wiped her eyes, embarrassed, but the American MP waiting by the truck did not stare. He simply offered her a paper-wrapped bread roll. "Fresh from the bakery," he said. "Take it." Her instinct recoiled. She'd been trained to refuse enemy food unless forced, but she took it anyway, whispering, "Danke." As she bit into the warm roll, a lump rose in her throat again. She waited for bitterness, for cruelty disguised as kindness. Instead, she tasted soft dough, salt, butter. No threat, no trick, just bread. She studied the young soldier's face. He looked no older than her brother Matthias had been when he'd marched off to the Eastern Front with a packed lunch and false hope. The American smiled at her with the same awkward, boyish gentleness her brother once had. The realization hit her hard. The enemy looked like her family. The enemy acted like her family. The enemy was human. Her training had not prepared her for that. Propaganda had not warned her of that danger. For the first time, she feared not what Americans might do to her, but what she might begin to feel toward them. Back at the camp, she watched as a guard carried a crate of canned dog food toward the kennels. The label showed chunks of beef and gravy. Liselle's breath caught. It looked almost identical to the beef stew German soldiers had been issued at the front. Better, even. Her stomach twisted painfully. She imagined the skeletal faces of children she'd seen in Berlin last winter, their cheeks hollow, their bodies shrinking beneath wool coats. She remembered the day a 6-year-old boy had fainted in front of her apartment building, his hand still clutching an empty tin. Her vision blurred again. That night she sat on her cot, staring at the tin cup she had been issued. Dinner had been plentiful. Roast chicken, potatoes, green beans, a slice of cornbread. She ate slowly, methodically, unable to shake the feeling that she didn't deserve any of it. She whispered into the quiet barracks, not caring if anyone heard. "We starve, and they feed their prisoners." One of the other POW women, Greta, sat beside her quietly. "They treat us like guests," she murmured. "Like we matter." Liselle shook her head, tears falling again. "In Germany, we were told Americans were animals." Greta gave a bitter smile. "Then why do they treat us like human beings?" Liselle covered her face with both hands. Because maybe they are the ones who were right." A week later, she found herself sitting alone on the steps of the camp chapel. Father O'Donnell approached, holding a small tin of lemon drops. "These were sent from a parish in Chicago," he said. "Would you like one?" She stared at the candy, stunned by the idea that strangers hundreds of miles away were sending sweets to prisoners. She accepted a lemon drop and let it dissolve on her tongue. The tangy sweetness tightened her throat again. "Why?" she whispered, her voice cracked under the weight of her confusion. "Why are your people so kind to us? We are the enemy." Father O'Donnell sat beside her, his hands resting loosely in his lap. "You're not the enemy anymore," he said. "You're young women, far from home in the middle of a terrible war. That's all I see." Liselle's shoulders shook. "But we were told—" She stopped, ashamed to say it. "We were told you were monsters." The priest's voice softened even more. "I think they were afraid of what you'd learn if you ever met us." The truth opened inside her like a wound. She pressed her fist to her mouth, fighting the sob rising in her throat. "We were lied to," she whispered, her body folded inward as she cried, deep, breaking sobs that came from years of fear and indoctrination. Father O'Donnell remained beside her, silent, steady, letting her grieve not only the war, but the world she once believed in. That night, as the Texas sky turned indigo and the camp lights flickered on, Liselle stood by the fence line, staring toward town. She could see the water tower, the faint glow of street lamps, the steady pulse of a community untouched by hunger or ruin. She felt her heart break and heal at the same time. She said the words out loud, letting them drift into the warm evening air. "We were wrong. America is not the enemy. America is something else." She didn't yet have the language for what that something was. Strength, compassion, abundance, faith. But she knew this: the world she had been raised to believe in was gone. And the new one, unfolding around her in small, tender gestures, was frightening only because it was real. In the quiet of that Texas night, Liselle pressed her palm to her chest and whispered the truth she could no longer deny. "We're Worden, belogen. We were lied to." For the first time since the war began, she felt the ground beneath her shift, not with fear, but with awakening. And somewhere deep inside her, a seed of gratitude took root, fragile, trembling, alive. The morning that changed Liselle's understanding of America began quietly, without any hint of revelation. She woke before sunrise, the barracks still dark, and stepped outside into the cool Texas dawn. The sky glowed faintly orange over the fields, and for a moment she simply breathed, deep, steady, without fear. It struck her how unusual that felt, to breathe without fear. A few yards away, 2 American guards were speaking in low voices as they switched shifts. She heard one say, "My mom sent extra pies. I'll drop some off at the infirmary later." Baking pies, in the middle of a world war, for prisoners. She watched the young guard walk away, and warmth, not fear, not confusion, but something approaching admiration, stirred in her chest. Her awakening had begun long before this morning, but now she recognized it. That afternoon, Liesel was sent to help clean the administrative office. As she swept the hallway, she overheard two officers discussing a supply shipment. "Another train of grain coming in from Kansas," one said. "Hard to believe how much food this country produces." "Enough to feed half the world," the other replied. Liesel paused mid-step. Half the world. She remembered Berlin, its empty shelves, its ragged bread lines, mothers cutting rations into invisible pieces so their children might survive another night. Germany had whispered that it could overcome hardship through willpower, discipline, sacrifice. But willpower could not replace wheat, discipline could not produce steel, sacrifice could not turn rubble into factories. America didn't win because its soldiers were stronger. It won because its people were fed. Its factories roared day and night, and its land seemed to spill abundance as naturally as breathing. She thought of the giant canning facility the camp truck had passed last week, steam rising from its roof like a great iron beast. Women in bandanas and denim carried crates of peaches and green beans as efficiently as soldiers moved ammunition. War had not weakened America. It had mobilized it, and she saw it now with stark clarity. A nation that never knows hunger cannot be defeated by a nation that has forgotten what fullness feels like. A week later, Liesel was assigned to work in a schoolhouse attic where supplies were stored. The teacher, Mrs. Porter, guided her up the narrow staircase and showed her where to organize the boxes of books and chalk. While they worked, Mrs. Porter spoke about her husband, stationed in Italy, her father, who grew wheat for military rations, and her two sons who spent afternoons gathering scrap metal for the war effort. "Everyone does their part," Mrs. Porter said. "That's what it means to be an American. Family." Liesel stopped sorting for a moment. She had never thought of war like that, woven through every household, every field, every small act of daily life. In Germany, war felt like a storm crashing down from above. In America, it felt like a rising tide lifting everyone together. She saw then what historians would later call the greatest generation, not as a slogan, but as a living truth. A nation where farmers, factory workers, housewives, students, nurses, cooks, teachers, pastors, and soldiers all carried the burden together, not because they were forced to, but because they believed in something worth carrying. America was strong because its people stood strong, and its people stood strong because they stood for one another. Nothing she had been taught prepared her for that revelation. Nothing Germany had told her could explain it. Back at the camp, Liesel often joined other POWs near the fence for afternoon work detail. One day she found the young MP from the supermarket fixing a broken section of wire. She hesitated before approaching. Why are you all so kind?" she asked quietly. The soldier looked up, resting his hammer on his knee. "Kind? Yes," she said. "You treat us better than Germany treats its own citizens now. Her voice faltered. "You treat us like we are still human." He considered her for a moment, then shrugged. "My mother says you judge a country by how it treats people who can't do anything for you." She frowned slightly. "But we are your enemies." He met her eyes with a calm sincerity she had never seen in a soldier before. "Ma'am, we treat prisoners well because that's how Americans are supposed to live. War doesn't change that." The words were simple, but they carved themselves into her chest. That's how Americans are supposed to live. It was not arrogance. It was not propaganda. It was a moral code. One lived, not spoken, For the first time in her life, she understood that decency was not weakness. It was strength, a strength her own nation had underestimated, a strength powerful enough to reshape an enemy's heart. One evening, Mrs. Baker invited Liesel to stay for supper, not as labor, not as charity, as company. The Bakers' two young sons ran circles around the table, laughing, arguing about baseball, completely unaware of the enormity of the moment. Mr. Baker bowed his head for grace, and they all followed. After the prayer, Mrs. Baker placed a warm loaf of bread in Liesel's hands. "Would you cut the first slice?" she asked. No one had ever asked her to do such a thing. She glanced at the family, the gentle expectation in their eyes, and something inside her softened, loosened, opened. She sliced the bread slowly, carefully. It felt like becoming part of a world she had once believed she was unworthy of even observing. After supper, she helped wash the dishes. The boys gathered around her at the sink, asking questions in excited bursts. "Do German kids have schools like ours? Do you have baseball? What's your favorite candy?" Liesel laughed, a sound she hadn't heard from herself since she was a teenager. When she returned to camp that night, she felt lighter, different, more alive than she had in years. And with that warmth came a desire to give back. The next morning, Liesel quietly approached the camp administrator. "I would like to help," she said, "in any way I can." She began teaching English to other POW women using children's books from Mrs. Porter. She translated letters for those who struggled to write home. When the Bakers invited her again, she offered to cook a meal, something German, something from before the war had stolen flavors from her memory. She baked apple cake with cinnamon borrowed from Mrs. Baker's pantry. When the boys tasted it, their eyes widened with joy. "You gotta teach Mama how to make this," one of them exclaimed. Liesel laughed again, soft, genuine. It was not just gratitude. It was a rediscovery of who she could be when she wasn't defined by war, fear, or propaganda. What she felt now was not simple admiration. It was understanding. America's power did not lie in its tanks or planes or ships, though it had unimaginable numbers of all. Its power lay in the ordinary hands of its people, the farmer, the baker, the teacher, the factory girl, the priest, the young soldier who offered a handkerchief to a prisoner. These were the hands that built the nation. These were the hands that held it together. And now somehow they were reaching out to her. One night, lying on her cot with the distant sound of crickets drifting through the open barracks window, she pressed the handkerchief to her chest and whispered, "They are strong because they choose to be decent." That was the truth she had searched for. That was the revelation breaking open inside her. She had come to America terrified. She was staying awake now because she could not stop thinking about how this country, its people, its goodness, had begun to change the way she saw the world, and perhaps, most astonishingly, the way she saw herself. When the war finally ended, the notice arrived at Camp Brenham with an emotion Liesel could not name. The guards read the orders aloud in the yard. Repatriation would begin within weeks. Germany, whatever remained of it, was calling her home. Home. The word no longer felt steady. On her last morning in camp, she folded her few belongings into the canvas POW bag she'd carried across an ocean. Most of what she had been issued would stay behind. But three things she could not part with. The white handkerchief the young GI had given her, a metal spoon she had polished every night as though honoring it, and a thin journal filled with her handwriting, notes about America, sketches of the Baker family's kitchen, poems copied from Father O'Donnell's books, and moments she wanted never to forget. She held the handkerchief a long while before placing it carefully on top. It still carried the scent of camp soap, faint but present, symbolic not of captivity, but of dignity returned. When the transport truck rumbled through the camp gates, many of the women cried. Liselle didn't cry until she saw Mrs. Baker standing beside the road, waving a small American flag in one hand and clutching a hand-woven basket in the other. "For your journey," Mrs. Baker called out, stepping closer as the truck paused. She pressed the basket into Liselle's hands. Inside was cornbread wrapped in cloth, 2 apples, and a note that simply read, "You will always have a place at our table." Liselle tried to speak but could only manage a whisper. "Thank you. For everything." Mrs. Baker touched her cheek gently. "Remember what you saw here. The good and the bad in this world. Both matter." They did not hug. Wartime propriety held its silent boundaries. But their eyes held the embrace instead. As the truck started forward, Lisa looked back at the camp, a place she once feared, then questioned, then slowly learned to appreciate. It drifted into the distance like a dream she knew would stay with her forever. Germany was almost unrecognizable when she returned. Cities flattened, streets quiet, faces hollow, hunger still waiting in the doorways. But Liselle carried something her neighbors did not, the knowledge that mercy could exist even after the world fell apart. She rebuilt her life, piece by piece. She married a schoolteacher. She became a mother. She kept the spoon on her kitchen shelf, the journal in her nightstand drawer, and the handkerchief folded neatly beside her Bible. She never stopped telling her children about America. "At the moment we had nothing," she would say. "America fed us. They could have let us die, but they chose mercy. They chose to be decent when cruelty would have been easier." Her children grew up hearing names they had never met: Mrs. Baker, Father O'Donnell, the cowboy who tied her shoes, the young GI who offered bread without suspicion. And they listened to the stories of the POW camp not as tales of imprisonment, but of unexpected grace. When Liselle became a grandmother, she told the stories again, slower now, with more pauses, more emotion. Her grandchildren would lean forward, eyes wide. "Oma, were you scared?" "Yes," she always answered. "But kindness is powerful, sometimes more powerful than fear." Decades later, long after her hair had silvered and her hands had grown soft with age, her granddaughter discovered an online video titled German POWs in America: The Stories You Never Heard. She clicked play. It told stories like Liselle's, about cowboys teaching prisoners to ride horses, about American farmers sharing Thanksgiving dinner with German captives, about POWs returning home with gratitude instead of hatred. Her granddaughter listened closely, heart swelling, recognizing pieces of her grandmother's life echoed by strangers. When the video ended, thousands of comments filled the screen. "My grandfather survived because Americans treated him kindly." "My family owes everything to the United States." "My Oma told me the same story. Thank you, America." She scrolled further and saw another kind of comment, written by Americans themselves, older people remembering fathers, uncles, grandfathers who had guarded POWs during the war. "America used to be like this. We were a kinder nation then. My dad always said, we treated them right because it was the right thing to do. We once built ships, fed the world, and held ourselves to a higher standard." Her granddaughter felt tears rising. She clicked the comment box and, with hands trembling slightly, wrote, "My grandmother was one of them. She came home with a clean handkerchief and a new belief in humanity. America showed her mercy when she expected punishment. My family is here because of the kindness she received. She hit post. In her final years, Liesel would sit on a bench outside her small home in Germany, sunlight warming her face. Children played in the streets again. The world felt gentler, safer. Sometimes she would take out the old handkerchief, unfold it carefully, and trace its edges with a fingertip. Her husband would join her, and she would tell the story again, not of battles or politics, but of ordinary people who chose to act with extraordinary heart. And she would say, as she always had, "I learned in America that strength is not the power to destroy. Strength is the ability to remain kind when the world tells you to be cruel." Her grandchildren would nod, listening, and somewhere among them one would whisper, "Oma, America must have been different back then." Liesel would close her eyes, remembering the supermarket aisles, the ranch fields, the warm kitchens, the shared meals, and the gentle faces of the people who had shown her unexpected mercy. "Yes," she would say softly, "it was, and I hope it can be that way again." Many years later, long after the war, long after Germany rebuilt itself from the ashes and America turned its gaze towards new horizons, Liesel returned to the memory that refused to fade. Not the camp, not the guards, not the long voyage across the Atlantic, but the supermarket. She remembered standing beneath the white lights, surrounded by rows of food she had never imagined existed in such abundance. She remembered holding a can of peaches and feeling the truth break over her like a wave. And she remembered the tears, hot, helpless, overwhelming, not from fear, but from understanding. It was in that moment, not on a battlefield, that she finally comprehended the meaning of strength. She would tell her children, "The greatest generation was great not because they won the war, but because they stayed human in the darkest of times." She told them how American soldiers shared bread with those who had been taught to hate them, how cowboys taught frightened prisoners to ride, how housewives used rationed sugar to bake cornbread for strangers in enemy uniforms, how a priest brought German poetry to women who believed they had lost their language forever. These people, she would say, were powerful because they were kind. They had every reason to be cruel, and chose not to be. Her children never questioned the reverence in her voice. They grew up believing that goodness could survive war because they knew someone who had lived inside that miracle. Years later, when her granddaughter played the old stories for her own children, Liesel would watch quietly from a rocking chair, her hands folded over the handkerchief she had kept all her life. America had changed, her granddaughter often said. It was angrier now, more divided, more tired. And Liesel would nod, though she didn't pretend to know the answers for the world her grandchildren inherited. "I only know this," she would say softly. "There was a time when America showed mercy to the people it had every reason to despise. A time when unity was not just a word, but a way of living. A time when decency was not weakness, but a source of strength." She would pause, letting the memory fill the room again. The clang of the supermarket door, the hum of refrigeration units, the soft voice of Mrs. Baker asking if she was all right. "In that place," she continued, "I saw what a great nation looks like, not because of its weapons, not because of its victories, but because of the way it treated those who could give it nothing in return." Her granddaughter once asked her, "Do you think America can be that country again?" Liesel smiled, a weathered, knowing smile shaped by 8 decades of watching humanity repeat its cycles. "Yes," she said, "if it remembers. If it remembers that abundance is not measured only in food or factories, but in compassion. If it remembers that unity is forged not in agreement, but in shared purpose. If it remembers that strength is proven not by how enemies are defeated, but by how they are treated after the fighting ends. Kindness never made America weak, she said. It made America great. Sometimes, near the end of her life, she would close her eyes and return to that first supermarket aisle, the brightness, the order, the unimaginable plenty. She would see herself standing there again, younger, thinner, trembling as she held the can of peaches. A single can, simple, ordinary, yet powerful enough to unravel years of fear and teach her a truth that shaped the rest of her life. In her memory, she held it tightly. She felt the cool metal against her palms, and she whispered once more the words she had spoken only to herself on that day. Thank you. Not for the peaches, not for the bread or the milk or the safety, but for the revelation that mercy could live even in wartime, that humanity could survive the worst of the world, and that a nation could choose compassion over vengeance and win something greater than victory. When she died, her family found the old handkerchief, the spoon, and the journal beside her bed. Inside the front cover, in her careful handwriting, was the final lesson she had carried across a lifetime. They showed me who they were. America chose kindness. And in doing so, they chose greatness.